It has turned around in the most astonishing period of time. In 100 days, this president has wrought so much destruction on things that actually did make America great. The Democrats are in complete disarray after their defeat in November, and they don't know how to respond to this moment. Some of them think we need to fight this administration with every tool at our disposal because it's unraveling. I think opinion polls have shown pretty decisively now that the British have rather decisively come to the conclusion that Brexit was a mistake. Donald Trump is creating the perfect opportunity for a British Prime Minister to say the geopolitical situation has changed. We have to understand that our interests lie in rebuilding with the EU. We have a very valuable relationship with the US. We're always going to try and preserve that relationship. But Trump has changed our geopolitical calculations, and we need to be bolder and more imaginative.
In more normal times, the 100th day of a president or prime minister was used as a benchmark. It would set the stage for the rest of their term. But obviously, these are not normal times. We're now 100 days into Donald Trump's second presidency, and the US will likely never be the same. In that time, we've seen power grabs, we've seen violations of constitutional rights, and we've seen flagrant displays of corruption. Perhaps most significantly, though, we've seen a massive shift in the international community. Nations are pivoting away from an increasingly chaotic and unstable United States. I spoke to Alexandra Hall Hall today, a former British diplomat currently stationed in Washington, to get a sense of where the United States is, where it's heading, and what this all means for the global community. Welcome, Alexandra Hall Hall. Great to have you with us. I thought we could kick off this conversation with a bit of background on you, give our listeners a sense of your expertise. You resigned from the Foreign Office in 2019, just before the major Brexit withdrawal agreement. Would you just talk about your diplomatic career, why you made that decision to step down, and what you've been working on since then?
Thank you. I'll try to keep it not too long, but I joined the Foreign Office straight out of Durham University, having been told by my careers advisor that no one ever got to join the Foreign Office if they hadn't been to Oxford or Cambridge. So I was glad to have disproved that theory, and I had a wonderful time in the Foreign Office, a career of over 30 years that took me all over the world. Bangkok, Bogota, Washington. I worked on the Middle East, I worked on the United Nations, I worked on refugees, human rights, war crimes, International Criminal Court, all sorts of stuff. It was absolutely great. I was ambassador in Tbilisi, Georgia. And then I came back to the States because I'm married to an American and we'd made our home here. And I had planned to take a career break, possibly even leave the service altogether. But I moved back to the States just after the Brexit vote, and I was working for a think tank called the Atlantic Council, and I had a kind of ringside seat watching what a complete and utter mess the British government was making of the Brexit negotiations. And as I was sitting there in this think tank, people would always say to me, "What the hell is going on with the UK? We thought you Brits knew what you were doing." We didn't think Brexit was a great idea, but we assumed that your government at least had a plan. And the problem was that because there obviously was no proper plan, there was no thought out strategy for Brexit, it left British diplomats really struggling to try and explain what was going on. And I was watching the British Embassy in Washington really failing to engage with interested parties in the US to explain what was going on. And they hadn't been given any extra resources either. Everybody was expected to continue with their normal jobs while this massive elephant in the room of Brexit that was redefining so much about the UK was hovering over everything we did internationally. So I actually lobbied the embassy and the Foreign Office and said, look, we really need to have a more coherent effort to try and explain to American audiences why Brexit is so difficult, what the difficult calculations are, and be more proactive in getting out there. And they ended up creating a job called Brexit Counselor, which they put out for a competitive bid. And I applied for the job and I got it. And I then spent 2 years as Brexit Counselor trying to explain to Americans what was going on with Brexit. And for 2 years, I think I did not too bad a job. I mean, I wasn't letting my personal skepticism about Brexit get in the way. What I was actually trying to do was just say to Americans, look, yes, it's a very difficult process. It's like trying to take the British egg out of an EU omelette. I mean, a lot of things have to be unscrambled. And yes, it is difficult. Yes, it is complicated. And it does look a bit messy from afar, but there are real substantive reasons why it isn't straightforward. And especially because of the situation in Northern Ireland, it was uniquely difficult for the UK. And I thought I was able to do a good job of doing that. But when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, um, the job became untenable because I wasn't trying to explain the complications of Brexit and the issues at hand. I was then being asked to tell basically complete falsehoods about the state of the negotiations and that we could have our cake and eat it and there would be no disruption to trade, there'd be no disruption to the situation in Northern Ireland and everything would be fine. And it just became harder and harder to do it with a straight face and to go to American businesses who have multi-million dollar investments in the UK, or to members of Congress who were very vested in the Northern Ireland peace process, or to diplomats in State Department who understand very well the workings of the EU, and just tell them with a straight face that everything was fine. And eventually, pressures became so unsustainable. I found myself in sort of cognitive dissonance because, contrary to the myth that diplomats are sent abroad to lie for our countries, we're not. And we're especially not supposed to lie to our allies. And so in the end, I made the decision to resign.
And so more recently, you've been in Washington, correct? So we were just talking about earlier about how, the first 100 days in more normal times is a sort of benchmark for what the rest of a term is going to look like. And just because you've been there on the ground, I wanted to ask what your overall assessment of the last 100 days of Donald Trump is. How do you evaluate that, and do you think that America is is it a different country now?
It has turned around in the most astonishing period of time. In 100 days, this president has wrought so much destruction on things that actually did make America great. He has attacked independent institutions, he's attacked agencies of the state that regulate the country, keep the economy going, keep products safe, that produce world-class science and research into medicines and health and climate change. He has destroyed trust with allies. He has undermined confidence in the security commitments of NATO. He has sowed doubt amongst allies in Asia. He has sent the global economy into turbulence, and he has created a permissive environment for people in America to say things that previously would have been unconscionable. I mean, racial slurs, sexual slurs. He has said he's wanted to push back on sort of woke policies, advocating for better treatment for gender minorities, sexual minorities, racial minorities. But what he's actually done is created a permissive environment for rather bigoted people to come out and roll back decades in racial and sexual progress in America. And in the process, he's weakening America itself. He's undercutting America's standing in the world, and he's throwing into chaos the rules-based international order. It's quite an astonishing and appalling record. And as somebody who lives in Washington, it is hard to convey just how disorienting and destabilizing this moment is. Every single day, anytime I run into any friends or colleagues or any interaction with another human being in Washington, there is this unspoken sort of sense of dread and fear. And people say, "How are you doing?" And there's a meaning behind that question, like, how are you coping in this moment? People's businesses are being affected. I know dozens of people who've been laid off their jobs. My own husband's organization has had to lay off 80% of his staff because he used to get a lot of money from USAID and that's been cut. So, I mean, there's barely anyone who hasn't been affected by it. And there is the federal bureaucracy is pretty much frozen. Effective government has shuddered to a halt because everybody is terrified that they will be the next to be fired.
So I'd like to come later to the international sort of ramifications of everything you're talking about. But first, I was just wondering, what do you see happening over the next, just until 2028, I guess, assuming there is a 2028 election? Where do you see this project going in the next few years?
So I hate sounding so apocalyptic, and I've been accused of catastrophizing, but I genuinely feel if we don't actually look at this situation for what it is, we are going to underestimate the gravity of the moment. And the biggest disappointment, I think, that many of us feel is how the political class in Washington has failed to raise to this occasion. The Democrats are in complete disarray after their defeat in November, and they don't know how to respond to this moment. Some of them think we need to fight this administration with every tool at our disposal because it's unraveling the checks and balances of the US system itself. And others say, no, no, we need to learn from our defeat in November. Our policies were unpopular. We need to accept that the American people want tougher measures on immigration and crime. And like a curate's egg, we have to accept, we can't just dismiss everything Trump is doing. We have to work with some of what it's doing. I disagree, because even if you accept that there were policies on the Democrat side that were unpopular, and they were, and even if you accept that Trump did have a mandate to undertake some initiatives like tightening on immigration, the way he's going about it is actually attacking fundamental aspects of American democracy. So you can't be like Governor Gavin Newsom of California, who said, oh, this stuff, all this anxiety over people who are being deported to El Salvador is just a distraction. That's wrong. It is the issue, because it's striking at the heart of constitutional powers. Does the president have the right to deport people without due process? Right. And will he challenge court orders? So that's on the Democrat side. And on the Republican side, it's even worse. They have shown themselves to be completely pusillanimous and unprincipled. They are putting their personal desire to stay in power over the interests of the country and the viability of America's democracy. And they are not challenging what Trump is doing. And many Republicans privately know perfectly well that what he's doing is challenging to the limits America's Constitution. And many of them are on record in previous years saying Trump is a threat, Trump is a danger, they think it would be unwise to re-elect him, or that they preferred somebody else. And they've all completely caved. So looking at the scenario today, it is clear that Trump's popularity is waning. It's clear that large swathes of the American population have serious doubts about how he is going about business, that they may agree with his efforts to cut the size of the government or to tighten up security along the border with Mexico, but they think he's going too far, too fast, too extreme. They don't like the challenging of the courts. But I don't see where the resistance is coming from in the political establishment. And my worry is that any normal Democrat leader faced with declining poll numbers would course correct. My worry is that this administration will double down,
Mm. Yeah, it seems
that
like
they
it.
are actually thriving on the chaos. And the more chaos they generate, the more they can argue, well, we need to take even more extreme measures to respond to this moment, and that turmoil is what they thrive on. And then I've just written a piece for Byline Times saying that I have an even greater worry than all of that, which is in the end, they will have committed so much destruction and broken so many norms of American democracy that they will create an even more vested interest in staying on in power, because the minute they step office, all of them will face lawsuits and they
Mm.
will be exposed. And so they actually have it, like all sort of authoritarian regimes, they will need to do whatever they can to stay on in power. So I
Right.
don't see a hopeful scenario. There are pundits saying, at the 100-day point, Trump will back down. I
Mm.
don't think he will.
Me neither. I guess I would just last thing on that I would ask is to what extent do you see it? Is Trump a one man band? I mean, obviously he's getting up there in age, and at a certain point you'd expect in an authoritarian regime to pass the torch. Is JD Vance, cut out for that, or does it end with Trump? Do you think?
So there do appear to be a much stronger group of people around Trump
Mm.
who are implementing his project. Not all that he is doing are actually Trump's own ideas. He is the figurehead, but there are a lot of organizations behind this. The Heritage Foundation and its famous Project 2025 is the most obvious one. And he has those people in the White House around him: Stephen Miller, Russell Vought, the head
Mm.
of the Budget and Management Office, um, Tom Lohman, the head of the border security, who's enabling all this tough deportation. His poisonous Barbie in the press office, Caroline Levitt, spouting falsehoods. There is a far more organized effort behind him.
Mm.
So, although many people believe Trump is the only one that, for reasons that completely elude me, appears to have the charisma. I find him completely rebarbative in every sense, but apparently he has great charisma for his devoted cult of followers. There are far more organized platforms behind him. There's more money, there's more systematic thought being put into this. If and when Trump himself goes, I don't necessarily think JD Vance becomes the next figurehead for this movement, although
Mm.
obviously he would like to be.
Mm.
But Trumpism, all the forces behind him, won't go away.
Mm. I just wanted to come to just Keir Starmer, because obviously, I mean, we had Brexit, and the UK sort of had its big populist right wing populist moment, but there was sort of an expectation that under a Labour government things would return to a semblance of normalcy, and then obviously the Trump comes in and he's sort of got this very difficult tightrope walk, that he's trying to manage. How do you evaluate the UK government strategy in terms of trying to appease Trump, obviously not giving him too much, and then also sort of juggling this, Europe really going its own way in the last couple of months, or signaling that they want to go their own way at least?
It's a very difficult high wire act.
Mm.
And actually, just drawing on the British example, I mean, I think opinion polls have shown pretty decisively now that the British have rather decisively come to the conclusion that Brexit was a mistake. And yet, the populism behind it hasn't gone away in British politics. And in fact, even as the Conservatives are struggling to stay afloat, instead you see Nigel Farage and the Reform Party gaining momentum. So once you've unleashed those forces, they don't just neatly go away and you don't
Mm.
neatly course correct. And one of the things we've seen with Keir Starmer is he seems to believe he's still held hostage to the 2016 Brexit referendum, and
Mm.
he is scared to challenge that. And so he is still boxing himself in by saying no return to the single market, no return to the customs union. So now, the moment that I think many of us predicted when the UK left the EU has come to arise,
Mm,
that the UK finds itself in a situation where Europe and America are drifting apart on not just policies, but actually on values as well. Because Trump does not seem to share the same commitment to an international rules based order. He doesn't seem to care about democracy and human rights. He seems to have a completely values free approach to foreign policy. The European Union, imperfectly, still believes in those things, and ironically is now pitching itself as champion of free trade,
mm,
having been criticised for many years as being somewhat overregulated and protected. Um, and the UK finds itself somewhere in the mid-Atlantic.
mm,
And I've always used the analogy of someone trying to get on a boat, and you have one foot on the boat and you have one foot on dry land. And if you're not nimble, you risk the boat drifting away, and you've sort of got one foot on the boat and one foot on dry land.
mm.
And if you don't commit one way or the other, you end up falling in a splash in the middle.
Right.
And I feel that is where Starmer is that he's trying to reset relations with the EU, but he's trying to preserve relations with the US as well. But the US and the EU are drifting apart.
Mm,
And if he's not careful, he's going to fall in a splash,
mm.
neither one nor the other. And it's extremely difficult. Um, and I don't know how long he can play this balancing game. He wants to reset relations with the EU, but he wants to try and negotiate some kind of trade arrangement with the US that spares us the worst of Trump's tariffs. But in the end, I fear those things will be incompatible, and he may have to make a choice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit that I've always had a level of skepticism about the quote unquote special relationship. I've heard it said, even before Trump, that the relationship was sort of like that between a dog and a lamppost. There's a level of exploitation, I think, in terms of how America treated Britain, not so much as its ally, but maybe as a subsidiary. I guess I'd be curious to know what you make of that, and if this is sort of a moment where we should be reevaluating that relationship wholesale.
I always feel like the Americans were happy to indulge us
Mm,
in our notion that we had a special relationship. And I also feel for many years we did have a special relationship. I mean, the UK US security cooperation was actually remarkable. Um, And we did instinctively tend to view many international issues in very similar ways, and we respected each other. That was when the UK was a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. We weren't a great power anymore like the US, but we were an influential player. And we had a very capable military, not the same size as the US, but it was still a force to be reckoned with, and we were able to deploy it to effect. We were still a member of the UN Security Council, and we had an extremely competent, if I say so myself, international presence, both in security, intelligence, and diplomacy. That made us an asset.
mm,
The relationship has drifted over time as the UK has dwindled over time,
mm,
and Brexit weakened the UK on the global
mm,
stage. And I know many of the backers of Brexit don't want to acknowledge it, just as many backers of Trump don't want to acknowledge how much damage Trump is doing to America's stature on the world stage. And so our influence in Washington has declined as our stature on the world stage has declined. And as the UK economy has weakened, so the amount of money we've been willing to spend on our military has dwindled. The UK armed forces are a shadow of the former selves.
mm,
Our military capabilities are completely hollowed out. Our diplomatic standing has deteriorated. We used to have software in the form of DFID in our aid budget, but we've cut that back.
mm.
We've cut back the BBC World Service. And so, yes, we've become very much a weaker partner. And once we left the EU, the US looked for different partners to work with. Ireland is a good partner for them in the EU. The Dutch are a good partner for them. So the relationship has become increasingly imbalanced.
So obviously, going forward, there's a summit on May 19th about which Summer says is going to sort of be a big step in, as you say, resetting that relationship with Europe. What would you like to see come out of that reset? What's sort of like the best case scenario?
Well, I think some things that will come out of it will be very good. I mean, already Starmer has done a very good job of changing the tone of relationships with the UK and the EU. There seems to be a genuine warmth between him and the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. He and his team have made a really good concerted effort to rebuild relations with the EU and with influential players within the EU. There's none of the sort of stupid Liz Truss-like comments about whether France is genuinely a friend or an ally. We may still have some policy disagreements, but the tone is different. The tone is back where it used to be, which is we can have serious talks about policies. We may not always agree on them, but we don't distrust each other's motives anymore. Our security interests are aligned. We share the same values. We're neighbours. We have an interest in working together. And that shouldn't be underestimated because the Conservative Party approach under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss was really poisonous in terms of casting doubt, in the same way that Donald Trump has cast doubt on the nature of the relationship in NATO. That's what the Conservative Party was doing with the EU. That being said, Keir Starmer has boxed himself in by saying no return to the single market, no return to the customs union, no authority for the European Court of Justice over anything to do with UK-EU relations. Although the ECJ does still currently have some small influence as part of the relationship that Boris Johnson negotiated. And so that limits what's achievable. And so what I'm seeing emerge out of this is I suspect there will be a warm communique. There will be a commitment to a new era of strategic partnership. I think there will be announcements on a new defence and security relationship. I think there will be announcements setting out ambitions to improve some of the terms of the trade agreement. It's already been floated for a long time, maybe some measures to align our food and agricultural standards so that it becomes easier for British products to be sold into the EU. And I'm hoping there will be a commitment to establishing some kind of youth mobility scheme. But the UK's red lines will still limit what's achievable because the EU doesn't want us to cherry pick. So they are not going to give us agreement that they will recognise our certification of products or that they will recognise the qualifications of our professional staff so that we can do business in the EU, so that our services sector can travel and do business easily in the EU. The terms of the agreement negotiated under Boris Johnson worked in the EU's favour. They actually gave the EU better access to the UK than the UK has access to the EU. So there's no incentive for them to change that. And they don't want to create a precedent of cherry picking. So I think the mood music will be good. I think there will be some tangible progress in some areas, but it's still going to be far short of what could be allowed if the Labour government was willing to drop their red lines. And what's driving me crazy about all of this is Donald Trump is creating the perfect opportunity for a British Prime Minister to say the geopolitical situation has changed. We have to understand that our interests lie in rebuilding with the EU. We have a very valuable relationship with the US. We're always going to try and preserve that relationship. But Trump has changed our geopolitical calculations, and we need to be bolder and more imaginative. And to think that the world is still the same as in 2016, when the Brexit referendum happened, the world has changed. And I'm very disappointed that he's not being bolder on that. I'm not a politician. There's obviously a political calculation going on there.
Yeah, that's a great segue. I want to talk more about how the world has changed. So we talked about this sort of the rules-based post-World War II international order. Could you just, for our listeners, just explain quickly like what that is and what Trump's doing specifically to undermine it. And maybe also if there were already sort of signs, contradictions within it, that were preceding obviously the big ruptures we've seen recently.
Yeah, thank you, because I would have begun with that. The rules-based order was under strain anyway. One of the most fundamental elements of the rules-based order is through the United Nations, the structure of the Security Council, and all the conventions and charters and declarations that underpin the United Nations, perhaps the most profound of which is the prohibition against the seizing of territory by force. The prohibition against aggression, prohibitions against genocide, and a sort of common understanding on the rules of behaviour between states. And the Security Council is there to protect international peace and security, and ideally to take action when state invades another country. And clearly that's been eroding long before Trump came into office. You had the invasion and seizure of Ukraine and the seizure of Crimea in 2014. You had the failure of the West to uphold the red lines in Syria in 2014, when chemical weapons were used against Syrian people, and President Obama said this will be intolerable, this is a red line. Syria used chemical weapons and nothing happened. And there are so many examples of egregious conduct, grotesque human rights abuses. So it was eroding anyway. And in Trump's defense, or in the Republicans' defense, many would argue that the Democrats have been weak on national security. They have allowed the Europeans to get away for years without investing sufficiently in their own defense, that lip service has been paid to human rights and democracy and standards of non-aggression, but there has been a failure to uphold those standards with sufficient rigor, and that American deterrence has faded, and that authoritarian leaders around the world no longer respected America. And I think there is some truth to that. China's been testing, Russia's been pushing, Iran has been pushing, testing the boundaries. That being said, although one can certainly criticize the Democrats, Obama and Biden, for not doing enough to protect Ukraine, for not doing enough to uphold standards of human rights, for not being bold enough, they were still adhering to those basic standards. What Trump is doing is casting doubt on those very standards inherently. He, in his approach to Ukraine, is suggesting a peace deal that rewards Russia for aggression, that basically breaches the notion that you shouldn't be able to seize territory by force, and not even pretending, that's not what they're doing. He has abandoned, the values that underpin that rules-based order, and he's allowing to come out into sort of broad air. The way he's behaving by threatening to seize Greenland, joking about making Canada the 51st state, threatening to seize Panama by force, is it just sort of legitimizes similar action by other states. So the rules-based order was fraying already anyway, and he's just now putting the nail in the coffin. It is quite clear to me that if Russia made a move on Estonia, it's really questionable whether America would do anything about it. If China moved on Taiwan, there must now be a doubt about whether the US would respond. And so it becomes a free-for-all. And the point about the rules-based order, it didn't prevent all wars, it didn't prevent all conflicts, sadly, as we've seen in Sudan and Myanmar and loads of other places. But it preserved a sort of an overarching framework of stability. There were certain lines, there were certain parameters. And overall, the world was stable, and many parts of the world were being lifted out of global poverty, with free trade, with America upholding peace on the seas, that is now all at risk.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting to me is because I guess it's been a long time since America sort of as the global superpower, the hegemon of global politics, has had an economic competitor in the way that they have it with China right now. And I think it seems to me that's a big part of Trump's sort of tariff protectionist agenda is about sort of trying to contain that as much as possible. Is that the right way for them to be dealing with this sort of unprecedented geopolitical situation?
Um, I think that's very short-sighted because his methods are just weakening the US itself, as every economist, pretty much every economist, except for like two around Trump in the White House and Trump himself, understands that tariffs will hurt the American economy as much, if not more, than every other economy around the world. So, yes, it's going to hurt China a lot as well. But the Chinese and the American economies are completely intertwined now. And this was sort of one of the benefits of globalization is that as economies became more and more intertwined, the idea of a major war between major powers whose economies were intertwined becomes more and more unwise. That was the whole rationale behind the original European coal and steel community, is that you knit the economies of France and Germany so that it makes no sense for them to go to war together. And so, this is the whole thing about Trump is he's kneecapping America by withdrawing American diplomats from Africa, by cutting American aid programs in Africa and Latin America, by cutting the budget of the Voice of America and Radio Free Liberty. He's just kneecapping all these different ways in which America had influence and presence in the world and goodwill in the world. He's weakening America's ability to push back against Chinese or Russian disinformation. He's opening space for Chinese development projects to replace American development projects. He's creating incentives for African and Latin American countries to look to China for investment and for support. And he's encouraging countries around the world to think, well, if America's not a reliable trading partner, we'll look to trade with others. And if you're going to push back against China as a geopolitical threat, you need allies to do that. But he risks forcing American allies closer into the hands of China, not away from China. So it's completely counterproductive and short-sighted. I can't.
Sorry.
It's just madness.
There's a lot of talk, I guess, about us, the world moving into sort of a multipolar era. And, some other people saying that, the Chinese century is upon us and America's had its time in the sun. What do you make of that? I mean, for one, do you think that's accurate? And for two, what do you think that multipolar world would look like? Can you envision, a world without America as sort of the global hegemon?
America still is the most powerful nation in the world. It still has an unprecedented military. Trump administration is increasing money to the military. So it's going to be a force to be reckoned with. The American economy has a lot of strengths. I mean, California is the fourth richest nation in the world, if just by income. It still has a wealth of science and technology and skills. Thankfully, America has a decentralized system. So even if there's madness going on in Washington, it doesn't stop individual states having a lot of control over their own education and health policies. I mean, some of them may choose to do really dumb things like ban fluoride in drinking water or, so the damage that Trump is doing in Washington is going to have ripple effects around the country, but you will still have a lot of hidden strengths in the US. And it is to be hoped that there will be some course correction after the next elections, once they lose control of the Senate and the House, because they will lose control of the House for sure, and very likely the Senate if they continue on this trajectory. So I wouldn't count America out. Nevertheless, we are already moving into a multipolar world. America's allies no longer trusted. It's an extraordinary thing, but trust is broken. You can't rely upon America. There's no guarantee that America will course correct or that another kind of Trump will come along. So, Canada's looking to rebuild with the EU. Countries will look to form sort of alliances with the EU. Countries in Asia, like Vietnam, America slapped tariffs on Vietnam, which actually really likes America. 50 years after the war with Vietnam is over, Vietnam and America have quite a lot in common, including fear of China, and we're working quite well together. But Trump was threatening huge tariffs on Vietnam. So countries in Asia are going to be forced to hedge and possibly look to move closer to China. Then you have the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which now has 6 other members as well: Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Indonesia. Together, the BRICS or grouping makes up almost half the world's population and 40% of its GDP.
Wow.
They have a lot of disagreements within the BRICS. Nevertheless, they are trying to work closer together. They provide an alternative to the G7 and the G20. So you have all these different blocks and associations coming together. The thing I worry about, I just read an article in Foreign Policy magazine that chilled me to the core because it's put its finger on what would be niggling at the back of my mind. Some people say we're entering an era of new great power competition. Russia has the Eurasia landmass, China dominates the Asia Pacific landmass. India and Europe are big influential players. Then you have America dominating the Western Hemisphere. That's frightening, the idea of that competition. But what the Foreign Policy magazine posited is that Trump's notion of this is not competition, but collusion. America won't be the great power that it once was, standing up for the democratic world. It will just be another great power that colludes with Russia and China to divide up the spoils between them. Small countries be damned. And that's how he sees the world. Russia, you get Ukraine, you get Moldova and Georgia back, you dominate the Central Asia and Eurasia. China will look the other way if you move on Taiwan, but you look the other way while we grab Greenland.
Right.
And that is really chilling to me.
Terrifying. I guess to try to find a positive note to end on, if it's possible. If
spring is coming, yeah, summer's coming, yeah.
If we do get a Democratic administration in 2028, what do you think would be the path forward? Should they try to sort of rebuild that international order, or does it need kind of institutional wholesale reform? I know there's been movements for a while about sort of democratizing various United Nations institutions, World Bank and IMF. Is there a path forward there, or is it going to have to be? Is it about rebuilding, or is it about building something entirely new? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to whiff on this question. I can't think that far ahead. Trump has set things in motion, the consequences of which are hard to foresee. I can't, I pray for a reversion, but the world will have changed in 4 years' time. I'm not sure it will be able to rebuild in the same way. The post-World War era has gone. And just like in the UK, Keir Starmer feels boxed in by the results of the 2016 referendum, any Democrat-led administration may also find that they can't just put these broken pieces together again. I mean, Joe Biden was supposed to do that. He was supposed to be the reversion to the mean. He was supposed to restore order. But he kept in place some of what Trump had done.
Mm.
He was frightened to go back. I mean, he kept the tariffs in place on China. Um, and it wasn't enough to stop this populist trend that Trump had unleashed from coming back again in
Mm.
2020. They weren't able to stop it. So I can't look that far ahead. Um, that's a worrying thing to say. I don't know where we're going to be in 4 years' time. I mean, I'm just sort of going day by day right now.
Mm. Well, I think anyone who claims to know exactly what's going to happen in 4 years' time is probably lying to you. If you enjoyed that interview, please make sure to hit subscribe and ring the bell for notifications.